Hi, everybody. There's a scale many of you have in your bathroom, and I'm going to tell you about two kinds of scales. The first scale is a cruel scale. By the way, we're going to talk about human judgment and where it goes wrong. We're not going to talk about weight, but we're going to talk a little bit about weight. So there's a scale, and if it's like my scale, it shows you systematically as heavier than you actually are. It's a mean scale. Every day, it shows you as 5 to 10 pounds heavier than you actually are. That is a biased scale. Now imagine there's another kind of scale, which is not mean, but which is unpredictable. It is a noisy scale in the sense that on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, it shows you heavier than you actually are, and the rest of the week, it shows you as lighter than you actually are. It's a mischievous scale. That scale will make you delighted if you want to lose weight on 3 days and sad on 4 days. On average, let's just stipulate the scale nails it. Nonetheless, the scale is noisy in the sense that it is unpredictable. Human judgment is often biased, like the cruel, savage scale, and human judgment is like the mischievous scale in the sense that it's noisy. Bias with respect to human judgment has charisma. Do you remember the Beatles? Rock group? Bias is like the Beatles in the sense that it arrests human attention. There's a kind of aha when you find human beings are systematically biased. Taylor Swift is charismatic, like the Beatles, maybe more so than the Beatles, and that is the source of multiple Nobel Prizes in recent years, the demonstration of biases in the human mind, which is an invitation for reliance on models as bias-correcting mechanisms. Noise, by contrast, is so boring and unfathomable and invisible that it doesn't even have its own slide. Think of noise as like a character in a Hitchcock movie or something, which I'm sure is on Netflix these days, that is mysterious and puzzling, and you don't know who the villain is until the last 5 minutes, in which you discover that the person you paid no attention to is actually the killer. That's noise. Bias is a source of error. Noise is its quieter, younger sibling. And we're going to explore both of these sources of human error and how algorithms and models can help. Okay, see that wise doctor? That's a patient who's come into the doctor's office, and the doctor is as wise as the white hair and kind of placid expression on his face suggests. Let's stipulate that that doctor is making a judgment about whether this patient should be tested for heart disease. What we know is that doctors do really well in deciding whether to test patients for heart disease. That's why they're doctors. But that they also make systematic errors of two different kinds. Compared to models, doctors do worse than models. First kind of error, they test people who shouldn't be tested. Second kind of error, they don't test people who should be tested compared to the model. And the reason is twofold. First, the doctors overweight the current condition that the patient has arrived for. If the patient says, I have chest pains, the doctor sees red, the algorithm sees orange. The algorithm will give chest pains the appropriate weight. Second, if the person is old and male and overweight, the doctor will say, we got to test. The algorithm will say, we might test. Now, if you notice the over-reliance on current conditions and the over-reliance on demographic condition, those are two forms of biases. Those are cognitive biases, and doctors are biased relative to models or algorithms. That's kind of dry stuff, but the human consequences are not dry at all. What will happen is, compared to the algorithm, the doctor's going to order a lot of tests for people who don't need tests. That costs money and also makes a lot of people scared and anxious who have no reason to be scared and anxious. On the other side, the algorithm will say to the person who doesn't have chest pain, who has other features that warrant testing, test that person. That person is more likely to live and get medical help from very serious risks. So the comparative advantage of the model over the human doctor has real consequences. I've told you about bias. Doctors are also noisy. If it's early in the morning, the doctor might say, I'm energetic and happy, even though I have a patient before me who scares me a little bit, and the doctor will say, I'm going to test. If it's 4 in the afternoon, the doctor might well say, I'm tired, it's been a long day, no testing. The model or the algorithm is not going to be vulnerable to whether it's 10 in the morning, high energy, yes, or whether it's 4 in the afternoon, time for a break. Okay, let's talk a little bit about law, shall we? See that person in yellow? That person in yellow might get bail or might not get bail. Human judges in New York, and we are talking about New York where the data is collected, and this is zillions, the technical term zillions, of people like that person in yellow, will get bail if the judge decides the flight risk is sufficiently low that the person deserves bail. Here's what the data shows. If you use an algorithm to decide flight risk, it will crush human judges in New York in performance. What that means concretely is, if we relied on the algorithm rather than the judge, we could massively reduce the prison population and keep the level of flight, which is a good proxy for the level of crime, approximately the same. Pause over that if you would. We can jail no one more and yet reduce the risk of crime dramatically and prevent people from losing their property or from being punched in the nose or maybe even killed. Or if that doesn't move you so much, we can keep the same number of people, we can keep the crime level constant and dramatically cut the prison population. The algorithm will be more reliable in deciding on flight risk, so we can maximize along the dimension of how much crime do we want or how many people do we want in jail, and it will massively outperform the judges. What do judges do wrong? Well, if you're with me so far, the judges are like both kinds of scales. The judges are biased, like the cruel scale, in the sense that, not in the sense that they are racially discriminatory, we're not talking about that, but in the sense that they overweight the current offense. If that person in yellow did something terrible, but otherwise has a good record, the judge will be inclined to say no bail. The algorithm will say, you're data scientists, so you know what the algorithm will say. I'm a lawyer, so I know too. It will say, which means the algorithm might say bad current offense, person with a clean record, bail, which is the right call. The algorithm might also say not a bad current offense, a shoplifter, not so bad, but a terrible record, no bail, which is why the algorithm outperforms human judges. Okay, we're talking about professionals, judges who are pretty good, and doctors who are pretty good. Maybe that underrates them, but models and algorithms do much better in contexts in which the stakes are really high. Okay, let's talk about the nature of cognitive bias, and what we're talking about is our species and how we are like the biased scale. The idea of the bias scale is systematic departure from truth. Here are 5 biases. 90% of people believe they're better than the average driver. Think to yourself, if you would, do you think you're better than the average driver? I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand. I bet you do. Ask yourself if you think your sense of humor is better than average. Typically, 100% of people do, because we know what's funny. 94% of professors, I'm ashamed to say, believe that they're better than the average college professor. Think I am. I hope I am. Probably not. Smokers know the statistical risks of lung cancer and heart disease, but they believe that they personally are less at risk of lung cancer and heart disease than the average non-smoker. Pause over that one if you would. This is a reflection of the human tendency to be unrealistically optimistic. 80% of most groups have that tendency. I bet in this group it's higher than that. Hooray for that. Successful and smart people often benefit from optimistic bias, but it can put businesses and governments and individuals in big trouble. We tend to be, as a species, present biased, and there are good evolutionary explanations for that. Today and tomorrow really matter. Next year is a foreign country, and we're not sure we're ever going to visit. Later land. That can mean we don't take precautions against economic or health risks that will come to fruition, let's say 5 or 10 years out. Does this resonate? One goal of data science is to overcome present bias. Present bias and optimistic bias can be an awful combination. In assessing risks, and this is a Nobel Prize winning finding, people tend to think, can I think of an example of a situation in which it came to mind? Was there a flood in my city in the last 5 years? Has a pandemic occurred in my lifetime? What about crime? We tend to assess risks, that is our species, by asking, is it top of mind or not? Which can lead to hysteria. We've observed that sometimes, yes. And complacency. We've observed that as well. It means poor risk perception. People often show self-serving bias. What is the chance that the Boston Celtics will win the championship in the NBA? I say 100%. Okay, 98%. That's because I'm a Boston Celtics fan. If people are asked how good looking are they on a relevant scale, they tend to make an evaluation that is in their interest. Self-serving bias can create terrible trouble for governments and for companies. Algorithms, by the way, and models should not be subject to self-serving bias. Inertia is a really powerful force. Have you observed that? Changing from a status quo can be hard for humanity, and that means that we will be often unbiased if we are doing data, but we will be biased if we are doing humanity in the direction of adherence to the status quo. Okay, what are we going to do about that? With respect to biases, there's a thing that elephants know about. That big elephant is the dad elephant, I say. My wife disagrees. But I think the dad elephant is nudging gently the littler elephant by trying to overcome the little elephant's cognitive biases. Are you with me? Data science often nudges people in directions that combat biases. Nudges are often educative. It might be a reminder, which helps overcome availability bias or limited attention or present bias. That teaches people something, and data sure does that. Or it may involve more subtly architecture. If people are automatically enrolled in something or automatically exposed to something, subject to easy and costless opt-out, that's a nudge, and it can change lives. The effect of an opt-out design, as opposed to an opt-in design, is often to increase participation by 30%, sometimes 70%. It's spectacularly effective as a nudge, though it preserves freedom of choice. Think of nudges as either architectural or educative interventions that allow people to go their own way. They're like a GPS, but that overcome biases. Sludge is a curse. It involves paperwork requirements, reporting requirements, administrative burdens, waiting times, in-person stuff. Think of sludge as one of a candidate for public enemy number one with respect to biases. It is compounding present bias and inertia. We need nudges that reduce sludge. Okay, now here's the little person in the corner who doesn't have charisma. Noise. Noise is unwanted variability, not the hooray for that variability that produces creative solutions to problems, but the boo for that form of variability that patients and criminal defendants and job applicants are subject to when they enter a lottery which determines how their life is going to go, a lottery which depends on which particular person in what mood is making a decision that affects them. Wherever there is judgment, human judgment, there is noise and more than you think. So if there's anything that you remember from this talk, I hope it's that human judgment is wildly variable, often in circumstances in which we don't expect it. Doctors and judges, as you now know, are noisy. I have a co-authored book where there's a chapter on doctors and noise, which I wrote the first draft of. I'm a lawyer. I wrote it with trepidation. I thought, what are the doctors going to say? And of everything in the book, this has gotten the more kind of informative responses where doctors say, you're right, and you have no idea how bad it is. The volume of noise, meaning unwanted variability in medicine. In the criminal justice system, it's all over the place. Hiring and promoting are noisy. Interviewing is really noisy. In the first minute of the interview, often, the interviewer forms an impression of the candidate. I like that person, or that person's kind of terrible. Then the person will ask questions that correspond to the initial impression, and that can mean this person gets the highest mark or the lowest mark because of what happens in that minute, and what happened in that minute could have been something very different from what actually happened in that minute, which is a recipe for noise. Fingerprint judgments are noisy, startlingly. They're not wildly noisy, but yes, they are noisy. In business, there is a ton of noise. One noise audit my co-authors conducted suggested that underwriters are so noisy in their premium numbers that they are losing the company billions of dollars because one underwriter might say this is a $10 million policy, where another might say it's a $50 million policy, and the corresponding costs will be variable. Sometimes the clients will walk away saying, you're making me pay too much. Sometimes the prospective customers will stay there, but get too little in terms of billing. And the company projects that the noise that emerged from the noise audits involves billions of dollars in losses every year. I hope if you're following noise, variability, the villain of human life often, the villain of corporate life often. I hope you're wondering, well, what is this exactly? There are three kinds, and let's start with the most fun and end with the most important, shall we? If your favorite sports team won on Sunday, on Monday, you might well make different decisions from the decisions you'd make if your favorite sports team had lost. That's crazy, and that's not hypothetical. That's data. If people are in good moods because it's sunny out and they just had a great meal, their decisions will be different from if they're in terrible moods because it's brutal out and they're starving. Each of us is noisy individually. When I was working on this project, I was in a small group of guys, one of whom said that he knew he wanted to marry his wife within 2 weeks of meeting her. And most of us in the group were kind of in awe and inspired by that. But one of us responded, if I had married every woman whom I knew I wanted to marry within 2 weeks of marrying her, I would have 17 ex-wives. That's noise. That's noise. Okay, so the world of dating is noisy, and it's about mood. Level noise is the most intuitive. You might think that among business people or doctors or people who don't use models, some are just more severe and stringent than others. So you might think some doctors think, let's test a lot, I'm for testing. And other doctors are, let's go home a lot, I'm for watching and waiting. You might think some people in business say, let's take risks, and others say, let's not, and that produces noise within firms. You might think that some underwriters say, let's make them pay a fortune, and others might say, let's not make them pay much, and that produces noise. And level noise, the most intuitive, is really important. It's bigger than occasion noise. Models, by the way, aren't noisy, and they don't show level or occasion noise. But the most important is not occasion noise or level noise, it's pattern noise, where the basic idea is that people have different patterns in judgment. So some judges will say, if it's shoplifting, that's not so bad. If it's a drug offense, I'm going to be really tough. Others will say, if it's shoplifting, that's really bad. That's a life of crime. If it's a drug offense, who's the victim? Bail or light sentence. We all have different patterns of judgment in our mind, and that produces noise. What are we going to do about it? For both noise and bias, I suggest we need decision hygiene. And you are, I hope this is good news, decision hygienists. That's part of your job. That's what, is that a terrible thing to say? It's an honorable and in many ways heroic role to take in society, decision hygiene. To get at the nobility of decision hygiene, we have to explain why noise is so bad, noting that it doesn't have the charisma of bias. First, it produces horrible unfairness. If some people are hired or promoted, or some projects go forward or don't, when everything turns on the identity of the or mood of the particular person who chose, that's inequality of a sort that doesn't involve race or gender necessarily, but is arbitrary and therefore not good. Organizations that are noisy can be discredited. Employees can be disgruntled, investors too, and customers particularly. Noise is often felt by people who desert the operation. Potentially worst of all are costs and costs and costs. So often it's intuitive to think that if the average judgment is right, it's okay. But it's like a scale that is weighting you on 3 days and under on 4. They add up. So if a company is hiring a bunch of people because of the identity of the hiring person, who is, let's say, lenient, and not hiring a bunch of people because the identity of the other hiring person is tough, then you can end up hiring people you shouldn't and not hiring people you should, and those costs add up. Think of the insurance company losing billions of dollars. Okay, what are we going to do about it? If you take 7 people and ask for their independent judgments and use the average or the majority, the outcome is going to be less noisy, definitely, and less biased with high probability. Aggregating independent judgments in group decision-making, think doctors or judges, is often a terrific noise buster. For structuring, this will be, I think, intuitive to you, but let's notice it because it's more important, I think, than it might seem. My son asked me a little while ago whether Djokovic, do you know the name Djokovic? Best tennis player probably ever, though not my favorite, but probably the best. He was down 2 sets in the final of a tournament, and the question was, what's the chance that he would win? My son, who's 12, asked me that, and I said 50%. And then I paused and thought, that's the stupidest answer I could possibly have given, and that I had spent the previous 5 years studying exactly this kind of problem, and I should know why I told my son something really stupid. The reason I told him something stupid is I didn't disaggregate the component questions that would have to be answered to figure out what's the probability that he would win. If he's down 2 sets, he needs to win the third, kinda. The chance that he would win the third, conditional on having lost the first 2, even though he's Djokovic, couldn't be over 60%. Let's highball it and say 70. What's the chance he'd win the fourth? Contingent on that, let's say 50. Now we're talking 35% he gets to 2 all, and you get the picture. The 50% answer was completely idiotic. Super forecasters are human beings who are not noisy and not biased. They're real, who make excellent predictive judgments. They're a little like models. And one thing they do is they structure their judgments by disaggregating its component parts, which human beings are often loath to do. Guidelines are terrific at reducing noise and bias. You know about that. Checklists are often components in guidelines. They cut present bias and optimistic bias, and they dramatically reduce and sometimes eliminate noise. We need to delay our intuitions, whether we are intuitive in a way that's inspiring and phenomenal, or intuitive in a way like me on the tennis question, in a way that's screwy and dumb. Intuitions need to follow rather than precede judgment. And models and algorithms are the best means often of eliminating both bias and noise. Think about the doctors and the judges, or about domains with which you're familiar. Okay, I want to conclude before questions by talking about a widespread phenomenon that needs a lot of attention. It's called algorithm aversion. You can think of it as model aversion too. They stem from similar sources. Okay, see the doctor on the right? He's not the most confidence-inspiring doctor, but pretty good, right? He's got a tie, he has glasses, gray hair, kindly. And then there's a not horrific robot on my left who is, to the average human being, off-putting. So models and algorithms, have you noticed, don't, in typical groups of our species, produce bright smiles and cheers and a willingness to march behind a banner that says, algorithms now. In fact, I've noticed, even among really good law students and college students, the cheerfulness of the room sinks when they hear the word algorithm. That's a problem. And the reason it's a problem is signaled by the human propensity to bias and noise. So what we need to do is to learn to love, at least a bit more than humanity does today, models and algorithms. The good news is that we have some clues about how to do that. Okay, imagine you're taken to a place with the person who knows you best in the world. This is a real study, by the way. And you're asked, how good is my best friend or spouse at telling what I will find funny? And then there's a test done of how good your spouse, let's say, is at saying what you will find funny. What kind of predictions does he or she make? Predictions aren't terrible, but a model is going to do a lot better. A model, after you answer 5 questions about what you find funny, the model is going to outperform the person who knows you best in the world. Is that shocking or obvious? It's true. Still, people don't believe it and they hate it. They don't want the model to be the recommender of jokes. They want the person who knows them well. There's something that fixes that. If people are told how the model works, they start to like the model better. They're told the model has a ton of data about what people find funny. You've answered 5 questions. It knows what people like you find funny. That's how it gets it. Then people say, oh, that's okay. I'll rely on the model. Second, if people see a model or an algorithm and make a mistake, they get really sad or really mad. So this, I think, is deeply intriguing. People are forgiving of human error much more than they're forgiving of model error. If they learn that a model has made a mistake with respect to medicine, they say, no more models. If they learn that a human doctor has made a mistake, they said that they think that doctor needs to get better. They don't think, let's have a model. This is to suggest that people are really averse to losses. This is a behavioral finding. They're more averse to losses than they are pleased with gains. To lose $100 is more painful than to get $100 is pleasant. That's just how the mind works. And loss aversion with respect to model error is massive. Okay, what can we do about that? What we can do about that is to enlist loss aversion. Let's think about self-driving cars, non-technical term. If people see a self-driving car crashing, oh my God, they don't want self-driving cars. But if people know and are informed, 40,000 Americans die every year roughly because of human-driven cars, and self-driving cars are safer, if that's true, then people have the same kind of oh that they do when they learn why the model gets the funniness of jokes. To give people a sense of how a model works and to broaden the scope so losses are seen as human creations, not just model creations, that can be super productive. The last is the coolest, which if people have a sense of control, some kind of control, then they start to like models or algorithms better. It might be just a little bit of control. Maybe they decided to use it. Maybe they can depart from it in extreme cases. Maybe they can reevaluate it in real time. To maintain human control is a strong weapon against the potentially adverse effects of algorithm aversion. Okay, we are done. We started with the case of doctors doing great, but costing anxiety and money and health and lives compared to models, and with judges doing the same where the stakes are incredibly high. The potential use of models and algorithms, and this is why I really salute you, is spectacular. And the reason it's spectacular is quite specific. The human mind has evolved in ways that are, surreal in goodness, but in ways that show systematic biases. The human mind is frequently like the cruel scale. The human mind is more subtly like the mischievous scale. It's noisy. What we're seeing, even in the last 2 years, is opportunities to cut bias and noise simultaneously in a way that increases justice, lengthens lives, and improves human well-being. And we ain't seen nothing yet. Thanks. So I'm really eager to get questions, and I think there are microphones on both sides, or there are human beings and microphones. Sir.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. So in my line of business, bias can either help us a lot of make money or cause great losses, right? So you talked about different kinds of bias, which I appreciate, and you talked about how to mitigate the effects of it. But is there a way to systematically and quantitatively measure how biased we are? Perhaps like Briggs-Meyer test?
Okay, so there's a way in particular context to measure bias. So you can see, for example, whether people's risk assessment departs from truth and by what magnitude. Whether people are systematically more biased than others, there is data on this. The data doesn't give a clear answer about who's more biased than whom. It's highly suggestive, and not shockingly, that people who have more quantitative skills and are kind of good at math are less biased than people who aren't. But I wouldn't want to take that to the bank, because there are people who are like really good at statistics who in their ordinary life are so optimistic and present biased. So we do know something about this. There's not, so far as I'm aware, a test for how biased are you in the aggregate. And one reason that's challenging is that the biases are so diverse. So someone who suffers from optimistic bias might not have inertia. In fact, it might go just the other way. You can measure how optimistic people are. That's been done. And we know something about who's optimistic and who's not, but generally optimistic bias seems part of our species.
My question is basically about the data that we have already. I think there's inherent bias in the data that we've collected. So using models with biased data will also give you biased results. How do you account for maybe adding human judgment? What is the answer there of getting unbiased outcomes? Because I feel like we didn't really touch on that, how
right.
the data is could be tainted as well.
Okay, so that's a fantastic question. And thank you for that. And you're quite right. We talked in a very upbeat way about models and algorithms that are based on data which may itself be biased. Okay, I think we want to figure out what we mean by the word bias in this question. So if an algorithm that is, let's say, helping us predict whether someone will have a heart problem is optimistically biased, it would be extremely surprising, I think. That is, those who trained the algorithm, what were they doing? And in the relevant study, there's no optimistic bias on the part of the algorithm. If the algorithm is biased in the sense that it is, using the availability heuristic to assess risk, that would be fiendish on the part of the person who trained the algorithm and random. This is your line of work, but you'd have to work at it, yes, to do that? And I'm not aware of any algorithm that shows availability bias. In the judge study, it's just the opposite. The judges show a version of it. Now, where algorithms might be biased would involve a more ordinary language version. Let's call it they show some gender bias. They might be biased against women. Why would that be exactly? That's really interesting, and it could be. Now, if the algorithm is trying to predict who will be at the company 10 years in, and let's say there's nothing in the inputs that is biased, but the gender is predictive of whether someone's going to be at the company in 10 years, then the algorithm could give a plus to the guys and a negative to the women. And then you want to do something about that, I think, which is you don't want the algorithm to be allowed to consider gender. And you might actually do something with the algorithm to make sure that it doesn't include likelihood of being at the firm in 10 years as part of the judgment of whether to hire. That would be a pretty strong response, but it might be warranted. There might be an input. This is a whole universe of important issues you're raising. Suppose that in the criminal justice system, the algorithm is looking at arrests, number of arrests. Suppose the number of arrests is racially inflected, so that white people get arrested less often than people of color. Tom Hanks, I think, said the words, "Houston, we have a problem," and "Houston, we have a problem." That has to be fixed. So what do you do exactly about that? I bet your creative juices are going, I hope so, to think about whether there's explicitly intentional discrimination in data that's being picked up, or whether there's something more, not intentional, but it's more structural that's being picked up. Then we'd want to fix that. And in the study of the criminal justice system, which I told you about, there are ways to do that with respect to race. And in the medical context, I bet some of you are aware of this, there's a lot of work on picking up racial biases that are human, that models and algorithms, let's say to a significant extent, reduce. But it's not built into their nature that they would reduce them. They could replicate them or aggravate them.
Thank you.
Sir.
You had touched on a bit using like expert consensus forecasts to make decisions. And I'm curious how bullish are you on, let's say, like applying that, I don't know if you want to call it a social technology, to make decisions, and if you could either pick an organization or a kind of social problem that you'd like to see that technology applied more often, what would you pick?
Okay, great. So an expert consensus will reduce noise by definition. Whether it reduces bias is less clear, and we need to think of the comparator. So if you have an expert consensus among people who are, let's say, optimistically biased with respect to economic growth, it might be there's someone who is an expert but outvoted who's more realistic than the consensus, who would outperform the consensus. Generally speaking, the effort to identify the individual who's better is really hard to achieve successfully, so it can be a fool's errand. So I'm bullish on noise avoidance through expert consensus, and I'm more cautiously bullish on bias avoidance through expert consensus. If you have an algorithm or a model it may do a lot better than the expert consensus, especially if the average expert is biased. So here's a way to get at the reason experts do well, expert consensus does well. There's something called the Condorsay jury theorem, which says if the average person in a group is more likely than not to get the answer right, like 51% likely, the average or majority judgment likelihood of being right approaches 100% as the group gets bigger. And it's based on pretty simple math. So let's say the average person in this group is more likely than not to know something about the economy. If we asked all of you and then took the average, the likelihood that it's right is really, really high, close to 100%. But if the average expert is less than 100% likely to be right, then the likelihood the group gets it wrong is 100% as the group gets bigger and bigger, which is a reason to be more bullish maybe on machine learning. But for economic predictions of various sorts, the state of the art is to take the expert consensus, and it really outdoes even informed choices of, let's say, the most informed individuals, who may be noisy or may be biased, but you can't know ex ante. Sure.
One of the challenges that I've encountered, though, is that models are trained on historical data, right? And this historical data has entrenched those biases, those noises, and so it perpetuates in the future how you're going to predict. And so what is the boundary between identify those biases that have skewed the data historically in order then to bounce what's right, what's wrong, and to make changes on the historical data in order to counterbalance these biases?
Okay, so let's separate noise and bias. A model won't be noisy. It'll spit out the same answer every time. And while I'm not noticing you all leaping up with joy and delight to hear that, people don't, but it's great. So there's a little statistics that can show, and for some of you this will be more intuitive than for this lawyer, will show that noise is often as significant a contributor to error as bias. And though intuition doesn't get that, if you have no variability, that's a big gain. Now, I hope some of you are thinking, what if you keep getting the wrong answer? That's a problem. So no variability with bias is bad. But no variability with bias is, unless the conditions are very unusual, a lot better than a lot of variability and a lot of bias. So models, algorithms, guidelines will be noise, no noise, complete quiet. They won't build in noise. They might build in bias. Now, we have to disaggregate what kind of bias we're talking about. You'll know, this group certainly is going to know a ton more than I do. But if a model encodes a cognitive bias, it would be surprising. So why would a model encode optimistic bias or present bias? Now, maybe if it's trained on data asking what do people do in circumstances in which a risk is going to come to fruition 5 years from now, and the answer is nothing, then it would encode present bias. But that would be a pretty ridiculous effort, I think, at model building. Yes? Yes? Or no? Okay, well if a model is encoding present bias, fix it by all means. So I'm seeing from some of the expressions on the faces that there are models that encode human biases like present bias or optimistic bias. That's an opportunity. That's a fantastic opportunity for doing better. On the race and gender bias, we have a lot of work to do from encoding biases. But I'm thinking as I look at you, there's an enterprise here that would be a phenomenal achievement over the next 5 years, which is that the models will be noise-free, but they might well be biased, yes? Cognitive bias as well as racial or gender biases. That's an opportunity. Seize it. Thank you.